Good evening. My name is Vincenza LaGreca, and I'm chair of the McGill Medicine Parent Committee, and I'm the proud mother of Sabrina Nolan in the class of 2019. Thank you all for joining us. It's wonderful to have you here at this event. We have a wonderful panel of guests, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing them this evening. But to begin, I would like to introduce you to the Dean of the Faculty of Medicine. Dr. David Eidelman is a McGill graduate and a proud native Montrealer. He has served as Vice Principal Health Affairs and Dean of the Faculty of Medicine since 2012. He is also a member of the Board of Directors of the Centre intégré universitaire de santé et de services sociaux du Centre-Ouest de l'île de Montréal. Prior to his appointment as Vice Principal and Dean, Dr. Eidelman served as Chair of the McGill Department of Medicine and Physician-in-Chief at the McGill University Health Center. And in his spare time, Dr. Eidelman is the proud grandfather of a brand new baby boy. We are very fortunate to have Dean Eidelman at the helm of one of the top leading faculties of medicine in the country. Please welcome Dr. David Eidelman.
Thanks very much, Vincenza. Merci beaucoup. Alors, bienvenue à tous. Je suis vraiment enchanté d'être ici avec vous dans cet magnifique endroit. This is an amazing place, the Steinberg Center for Simulation and Interactive Learning, where students, I see students in the audience, the students know this is one of the special places where we're able to do amazing kinds of teaching for medical students, other health professional students, residents, and staff, and so on. And it's really one of the jewels in the crown of this university. So I know that there are parents here from every medical school class, which is fantastic, and I know there are people here from the Parents Committee, in addition to Vincenza. Thank you very much for your dedicated support. So tonight's panel is perfectly matched to the Sim Center, which is Doctors of Tomorrow, How AI and Other Technologies Will Change the Practice of Medicine. And we have, this is really very topical, given what's going on in Montreal and in the university environment here. But it's also, we're very fortunate to have a lot of strengths in these areas that are going to be able to be put on display in a few minutes with our wonderful panel. One thing you should be aware is that, here at the Simulation Center, it really is a place that has been very much at the vanguard, and we're fortunate to actually have one of our panelists tonight is Dr. Kevin Appel, who helped found this center, helped build it into the amazing place that it is. And we're going to hear from him. But we're also going to hear from Ariane Morelli, who is a professor of medicine and a director of cardiovascular research and a leader in cardiovascular research at the MUHC. We have Jonathan Kanevsky, who's a very recent graduate, MDCM 13, who's a plastic surgery resident, and he has developed an award-winning device to reduce scar formation. And Alexander Lachapelle, who I told is not related to you, Kevin, but who isn't even graduated yet, but has already made a name for himself as a Rhodes Scholar, and will be going off to pursue a PhD in machine learning at Oxford. And so I guess I'm gonna call each of the panelists up to say about, it says here 2 minutes. But I don't have a clock, but Donna does. Okay. But before I do that, before I forget something I forgot, I just want to thank Donna and the entire advancement team for setting this up and for organizing this. So without further ado, I'm going to thank the panelists for being here and ask Ariane to come up and take the podium. Or you're going to speak, I guess you speak from there. Yep.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Eidelman, and thank you very much to all the wonderful and proud parents who are here tonight. As Dr. Eidelman said, I'm involved with cardiovascular research at McGill University and at the MUHC, and this is, I would say this is a very interesting tipping point for us. We've seen technology evolve dramatically over the last 2-3 decades, and it's had a huge impact on medicine. In cardiology, we've been at the forefront of using technology from the stethoscope to the artificial heart. But something is going on here now that's a little bit different. And AI is definitely not going to take the place of doctors. I think that's the first thing I want to say. I think it's going to actually make us better and more efficient in many ways. It's going to change our profession somewhat, but I think it's going to do that in a positive way. And in AI in medicine, there's different areas. There's definitely teaching and training, and I'm sure Kevin's going to talk about that because he's been a pioneer in this area. There's technology for patients and digital health tools, which is we've been seeing as has emerged over the last decade or so in an accelerated way, and that's a very interesting area. We're working on a lot of tools to facilitate patients' navigation through the healthcare system, patients with lifelong diseases, patients with transition. And now there's just been a tipping point for artificial intelligence in research. And what's very interesting about where we are is that data science has evolved substantially. And medicine, although it's not just a science, is scientifically based and relies heavily on data to generate evidence which guides the way we treat patients. And with the advent of big data and data science, we now have an opportunity to do research in a way that we haven't done before. And I was talking to some very interesting parents who are mathematicians and computer scientists in the room, and who thought that all of that was going to really converge to create this incredible opportunity and tipping point for us. So I'm happy to elaborate on that further as we go, but I think I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you very much, Ariane. So why don't you just stay there, and we're going to ask Jonathan Konevsky to come up and say a few words.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you a bit about my experience at McGill. I like to think that I grew up in an AI household. My father, as many parents, kind of inspired me, but in an interesting way. He grew up deaf and had dedicated his life in computer science to speech recognition. So growing up was always a bit of a fun problem-solving experience with my dad, encouraging me to think about ways to think outside of the box. And I felt very fortunate to find that the first time they ever spoke the words big data to me made sense when I was in my first day of medical school, seeing that all this data that's surrounding us all the time in the hospital, and at what the time seemed very disorganized, now seems like it's kind of the forefront of medicine. So throughout the years of medical school and now in residency, I made a point to try and apply myself to find areas where the data that we use in the hospital every day could make for interesting applications in clinical work. And everything from cardiovascular disease to breast cancer seemed quite interesting to me. And I feel very fortunate to have been in a place that fostered that kind of research and encouraged the opportunity to work with other students and faculty that really brought me to where I am. So, yeah.
Thank you very much, John. So I'm now going to ask Alexander Lachapelle to come up and tell us something about what he's doing.
Thank you very much. It's also it's a privilege to be here as well on this panel. My name is Alexander. I'm a fourth-year medical student here. If all goes well, hopefully graduating in a few months. I come from the pre-med route, and
Med-P. Oh, sorry.
I agree. But my exposure to AI has been very progressive. So earlier in my medical education, I was doing a lot of work on surgical simulators, and then I kind of fell in AI by accident. And last year, I had the opportunity to work in an American startup that was applying machine learning to radiology. So how can we train algorithms to help primary care physicians and radiologists catch every single lesion and basically improve patient outcomes. And working in that field, I realized kind of two things. Number one was that there's a lot of potential for improvement and to help patients, but I also realized a second thing, which is that it's extremely difficult, even once you have a working product and you've done the research and you've published, it's very, very, very difficult to get that product to the patient because there's regulation, there's commercialization, and there's a whole infrastructure, even after the invention, to reach the patient. And so for me, that space, kind of the in-between of healthcare and innovation and entrepreneurship, and how do you make sure the amazing research that's being done everywhere reaches the patient was an area of interest that I'll be pursuing next year at Oxford. And I'm privileged to have studied at McGill because of how much support there has been to explore areas in medicine that are only clinical medicine. So there's a lot of global health work happening here. There's a lot of innovation work happening. There's a lot of work kind of in many areas around healthcare. And I think that's been a huge driver for me to pursue AI work. So it's a privilege to be here, and I look forward to meeting later this evening.
Thank you very much, Alexander. So finally, last and certainly not least, Kevin LaChapelle. Take it away, Kevin.
So good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here. I think it's just such a great idea and another innovative way of actually interacting with people in the faculty. So it's a great idea, and I'm happy to be here because I finally get to meet Alex, who over the last month I've had about 10 emails asking me if he was my son.
If I can just add, I get asked about it once a week if I'm your son.
Yeah.
So it's also good to meet.
What do you say?
It depends on the time.
Yeah, it is. So me too. It depends. You know, if I found out he's a Rhodes Scholar, so I don't answer it. I just say, you'll figure it out. But no, all kidding aside, I've been very fortunate to be a part of this university and actually be part of the university that was very forward-thinking at the time. We created the Simulation Center with the vision of the Faculty of Medicine with Arnold Steinberg and the family. And it was a great moment for all of us, and I think it's continued to be an important component of what the students and residents and people like myself do. And I don't know how many of you have had the chance to do the tour or see around, but I think what you notice actually, certainly in the newer areas, is that this is really a virtual hospital, an area, a lot of technology, but it's there for a reason. It's there so we can give very innovative and genuine clinical experiences to the trainees so that they can learn without harming patients. I mean, that's the whole idea behind it. And the idea about clinical experiences is really important because it's through clinical experiences that you gain know-how and eventually that you become an expert. And so we want to be able to provide those clinical experiences. The advantage of doing it here is that we can talk about those experiences afterwards. And in the clinical environment, sometimes it's very difficult with everything that we have to do and the busy lives that we have and another patient we have to take care of and so on. But this place at least is an area where you can stop and provide that guidance to the trainees. So it's really, I can't tell you how important it is, I think, in the education of the students and in the residents that come here. One of the things that has become quite clear to us also as a virtual hospital is that we have a very important laboratory to understand how things work in the clinical environment and also how we can impact care, either through increased technology, a little bit like some of the panelists have talked about AI, and also through some process in innovation, which I think the faculty and Dean Eidelman has clearly been a leader in allowing us to try to develop this unique model, and I think it'd be a unique model in Canada, to use the Simulation Center really as an innovation hub to meet clinical needs, create technologies and processes that are being unmet, and test them here before we put them into the clinical environment. So we're expanding our role. Our role is certainly in education and learning. It'll always be, but one of the areas that we're really pushing hard now is how we can use this as a virtual hospital in a way that we can improve clinical care in what we do every day in our everyday environment. So welcome again, and I hope you enjoy the evening.
So do we have any questions? Or because I have questions, but I want to hear from the audience. So there's a question over here. They're recording it.
I don't know how to say. Are there any other universities in Canada who are involved with AI?
Who's going to tackle that one?
Yeah.
Or maybe I shouldn't ask this question?
No, it's a good question. I just want to make sure.
I guess I could start with an anecdote. So when I first started getting interested in applying AI in research, I decided to just Google and see where the interesting places were in Canada. And I was ecstatic beyond belief to discover that Montreal is a world hub for AI.
Wow. Yeah,
Like beyond most other cities in the world. But every university is catching on to this AI buzz. So some of the leaders in the industry, Jeff Hinton, based at University of Toronto, Joshua Bengio, who has a strong presence in University of Montreal, but also works with a lot of different researchers from McGill. And then there's some interesting research being done in Manitoba as well. But I would say by and large, the sort of most exciting activity is happening here.
thank you.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you. My son, who's a McGill grad in computer science, works at Microsoft in Seattle in big data. So I'm very interested to learn and get some more discussion on how big data relates to AI, because it was mentioned earlier in your talks. What kind of streams of big data, for example, we're talking about, and the relation with what McGill is working on in these programs. Thank
So
you.
who wants to take? Ariane, you got to take that one?
So I think, I think when we talk about big data, there's big data and then there's big data. I think that when we talk about big data in industry and in consumer in consumer environments and commercial environments, we're talking really, really big data. In medicine, it's not quite at that stage yet. One of the strengths that we have in Canada, and one of the strengths that we've particularly developed in Quebec, is working with what we call administrative data sources. So when I came back to McGill and I was setting up a program in congenital heart disease, because that's what I was interested in doing, and there were very few patients, I started to ask myself the question, well, isn't it interesting, in having come back from the US, that every person is born with a single RAMQ number, and that RAMQ number follows them through life. And there had been some very early work done in this area. So we actually put together a database which happens to be the largest database in the world in congenital heart disease. So if you look at what's published in big data, it's not necessarily as big, but it gives us an entry point into big data in medicine. So we have developed this particular strength at McGill, I would say, and particularly in cardiovascular diseases, but in other diseases as well. And I think that this data will become richer and bigger when we start combining it with other sources of healthcare information. So we can now have data that tells us what happens to a patient through their healthcare, through the healthcare system during the entirety of their life. But what we need to do is we need to merge that with blood samples, which tells us about their DNA, with data that comes in from their Fitbit that tells us about their lifestyle, with data from their gut that tells us about what they eat. And together, all of that will create very rich data sets from which we can start predicting risks, and where we can start looking at how a person's risk changes over the course of their life. And that's where data science and AI are going to converge to really change how we treat patients. And it is going to help us to talk about managing health instead of treating disease. Not necessarily waiting until patients are sick and they come to the hospital and then we get a blood test and we get an x-ray. But how do we actually manage them through the course of their life when they're still healthy, but we understand that they are at risk for cancer, for cardiovascular disease, for metabolic conditions, for diabetes, for falls, for hip fractures, for all of that. So I think that's going to be a very interesting, evolving area. But the data science is evolving in medicine.
Kevin?
I just wanted to give you a perspective on in terms of education and data and education, because one of our role is actually to create excellent doctors and to be able to predict that they're going to do what they say it is that they should be able to do. And you would think that that would be relatively easy to do, and it's not actually. It's quite complex. You know, the basic way in which we certify that someone has been able to do the things that they say they can do is we give them a multiple choice question, a short answer question, or so. And we know that those test knowledge, but not necessarily know-how, and certainly not necessarily that they can do things. And we're just scratching the surface on what are those kinds of data points that we need to know, which ones are actually the metrics that we should be looking at, and you know, how would we measure them? And then, for example, how would we give feedback to the people that are not meeting them? And I think those are the questions that we're trying to answer here. And, you know, I think we were talking about it before, that maybe AI has a certain element there that they can give us information about simple things such as communication skills. You know, walking to a doctor's office and being able to discuss diagnosis and so on and so forth. So data science from a very maybe more simplistic point of view, but very important on things that we're not actually meeting right now.
That's great. There's another question over there.
Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this fascinating meeting. One reason why I would like to ask the question is that the subject of AI is very dear to my profession and professional life, because I actually do AI in a commercial space for a large telecommunication company. Plus, I teach data science and data mining at John Morrison School of Business. And where I used to try to invite my daughter to my class, but she resisted, and so far successfully. So I was wondering if you have a program here, and how, for example, Alexander, how did you learn data mining? From the books by yourself, or is there a more formal program at Faculty of Medicine that actually provides this kind of training?
It's all over to you, Alex.
I think different people get into the field very different ways. In my case, at the beginning, I started just on social media reading articles from McGill professors, UDM professors on AI, and I just got an interest in it. So I started kind of reading a lot on the side and then teaching myself online. There's a lot of modules online. And then for me, the big difference is as soon as I had any question, it was very easy to access mentors within the community that could either give me an answer or tell me I don't know and then refer me to someone else who could help me. And I think the ability to go from a person to the next and always have a person to ask a question to is very helpful. That being said, I know after speaking with Dr. Appel earlier that I think there's a lot of work being done now to establish a more formal process to help students and help the community with the field.
You're at Concordia, right? John. So do you know Thomas Fevens? Do you know Thomas in the computer science department?
No, I'm in the School of Business, so I don't know.
So it's like McGill. Sometimes your next door neighbor you don't know, and they're doing the same work you are. But so he's actually in the computer science. We've actually hired him as an adjunct professor here, and he's going to give the first class in AI in medicine as part of the innovation course that we have. So, and that I think we're at early days. Perhaps you're not so much in early days, but I think the idea here is to put and I think what Alexandre was trying to point to is to put the people from very different backgrounds together. So putting a computer scientist together with a clinician, with a business person, and so on, that's going to be the right mix, right? You're not going to be able to do it, either one of you, on your own, but together you will. And so I think that would be the future.
The only thing I would add to that is that it's one of the limitations of medical school, what the medical students present will attest to, that there is an enormous amount of material to cover. It is largely determined by accreditation requirements and standards, and we have to cover that material. But we try and create an environment where kids like Alex or others are able to, if they have a special interest, like AI or social engagement or music or other things, we have a very rich environment here in McGill and in Montreal where our students can find themselves and use what little free time they have to do cool things. So we can't put everything in medical school that is relevant to practicing medicine. And in fact, I'll just remind you that unlike, let's say, I don't know, even law school, you have to go to bar school afterwards, but certainly unlike even nursing school, where once you finish, you can get a license and start practicing as a nurse. All that medical school graduation entitles you to is to learn how to be a doctor as a resident. Okay, so it's a different, because each career in medicine is somewhat different. So it's really core material. It's just to keep it in perspective. But despite that, we have such brilliant students that I mean, Alex is obviously sitting here, so I'm embarrassing him. But in fact, many of our students pursue special interests, whether scientific, cultural, or social. And we have really amazing things that your kids are doing every day that I didn't do. Yes, there's a question. I was the boring student taking notes a lot.
I just wanted to add, so every spring I have the chance to teach the first year medical students on burns, and I dedicate a good 40 minutes of that time to explaining the very fundamentals of machine learning and how it applies to different clinical applications.
I didn't know that.
So it's just a sort of like a, by the way, did you know this is happening? It's important. And then it's been kind of interesting to see the response from a lot of students, because they'll come up and ask questions, and hopefully that either sort of acts as an accelerant for them to go find out more, or to maybe look it up and learn more.
We have a question at the back from a student.
So, yeah, I'm a student. I had a question. By the way, great lecture from last year. But so the question is, earlier, Alex, so you said you worked in diagnostic radiology and AI. So I'm wondering, so from an internist perspective, respirologist, and from two surgeons, do you foresee a future where diagnostic internal medicine and treatment management and surgical, like robots doing surgery, do you foresee a future where this could happen?
So who wants to, I have an answer for this, but I want to see if one of the panelists wants to grab it. Alex looks enthusiastic.
I might start as a neutral non-clinician before the debate starts.
Yet, Alex, not yet at the clinician.
Yes, I think AI is very promising for very specific things, but I think a lot of it will take a very long time to be applied. I think in terms of diagnostics, things like radiology, computer vision, looking at an X-ray or at a pathology slide and finding the pattern, I think computers are better and better at. But as soon as there's any sort of human involvement, speech involvement, diagnostic planning, and as soon as you have to take into account variables for which you can't get a data set of 1 billion or 1 million points, it becomes more and more difficult. And so I think you see a lot in the newspapers or online is, will AI replace the doctor? Will I ever go to the clinic and have a robot speak to me? And I think an interesting way to look at that question is not AI versus physician, but more physician versus physician helped by AI. And I think we'll never be able to, in my opinion, fully replace the physician, but if we can give a physician the tools of reading 1 million papers in a few seconds and having a tool that can detect tiny millimeter thick lesions on an X-ray or a CT scan, I think this is only for the better. So my relatively neutral perspective so far is that I don't think we'll replace, but I think it's a huge benefit for the patient. And in the end, the whole purpose of medicine is to kind of lead to better patient outcomes. So if helping a clinician with AI can lead to better patient outcomes, why not?
Any other panelists want to handle that? Or because I wanted to add, because I'm actually familiar, Dr. Galix, who's the chair of radiology, is doing a project on AI and detection of malignant lesions on X-ray. And I had a chance to talk to him about it. I think most of the people who are really serious about AI see it as a tool, a computerized tool, just like many others, and it's exactly what Alex said. The principal who was at Davos last week said she went to a session on machine learning and stuff, and it was apparently the chairwoman of Duke's computer science department, who's an AI expert, and said she would never drive in a car that was programmed by one of her students. And what she meant by that is that AI and computers in general are very good at the things that Alex said, but when it comes to inductive reasoning, we're figuring things out from a quickly changing context. Current machines aren't really made for that. And I think the future is physicians and other health professionals working in teams aided by this kind of technology, but being able to do things that previously were impossible because the technology is there. We already have that. The students, as you probably know, all our students, thanks to a gift of Mr. Steinberg, learned to do handheld ultrasound in first-year medical school. Some of us graduated, that hadn't been invented yet. And it's a way of learning about how the human body is built and how it looks that gives you an insight that you can't possibly get in any other way. And that's something that is purely because of technology that was invented in the 1990s and the 2000s. It's hard to even imagine how AI and similar technologies are going to transform things further. Ariane, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I'm just going to relate a story that I think is interesting, and it was the impact of photography on painting. When photography started to occur, it changed the way people looked at light, and Impressionism came about. And when you look at the history of Impressionism and you look and you actually read what some of the Impressionists, the most famous Impressionist paintings were writing, they were actually influenced by photography and how light changed the way they looked at things, right? And I think that's a really good example of how technology changes the way that we look at things and the way that we use things. I think what's fascinating about AI is that now we're sitting here and talking about the machine and the human, and we're sitting here feeling threatened that maybe radiology is going to actually be disappear because there's going to be an AI with a machine learning algorithm that's going to do better than us, or that me as a cardiologist, I'm not going to have any work to do in the emergency room because there's going to be some algorithm that's going to tell me which patient has chest pain and is really having a heart attack. But that's not where the interesting part is. The interesting part is how we will interact with these technologies and this AI, and how that will change us and how we will change it. So it's really that interaction. And when you think about our phones and how we interact with that phone and how that phone has changed us and has changed your kids and has changed my kids, that's what becomes really, really interesting to think about.
And it's hard to predict. Other questions? Okay, so I think, yes, of course, I'm sorry.
I'm sort of curious about I'm sort of curious from the patient's point of view, with the data mining, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth, how consent will change. How consent will change before we sort of accept.
That's an excellent, excellent question.
Thank you.
So I think Jonathan wants to answer it. He looks very keen.
That's what I get for leaning forward. There's a great sci-fi book where they lists a set of rules for sort of the future, and one of them says technology changes ethics. And I think some of the important principles that we adhere to for patient safety and consent will always be present. But I think by and large, if you polled everybody in the room and said, hey, would you be interested in contributing anonymously your data, your personal health records, such that your future care might be better? I think by and large, most people would say yeah. But I think in terms of consent, that process would start when patients go to the hospital, and maybe we would see in the future that already your consent contributes to research that happens in the future. But there might be additional statements there. I haven't seen it change yet, but as far as research goes, that's its own consent process that you have to be able to prove to an ethics board that this research doesn't harm people, the data will be handled in a safe way. But I think by and large, I think that's going to be definitely a part of the consent process.
No, I find it fascinating because so many of us have trouble figuring out our phones. And so maybe sometimes in trying to explain to a client, a patient, what is involved in the procedure that he's going to undergo. There are things, language barriers, there's so many things, cultural barriers. It'll be an interesting field to explore.
So I think Kevin do you have a comment on that?
I think, on the downside of consent and so on is that I think we've missed a huge opportunity to mine databases that are already there in the hospital setting. And, we were fortunate to visit a group from Israel, actually, that, and what they've done is basically create an open campus with the hospital database, but it's a completely mirrored database, which is only for research and for understanding patient outcome, but it's all anonymized. I think it's a very interesting concept because, the 50 or 100,000 people that we need to make decisions for large groups are there. It's a question of how we're going to grasp that information and make sense of it. And consent's important. I'm not trying to say consent's not important. Please don't.
No judgment.
But I think
Dr. Lush Appel says consent is totally useless, right?
That's probably what's going to be said. But I think we have to, leverage that and balance that with the societal needs as well, which are huge because we're also paying for it. Absolutely. You and I are paying for it as well. So.
There's a couple other points on that, why I said it was such an excellent question that Kevin sort of alluded to. Quebec has the most restrictive consent and privacy rules in the Western world, maybe in the world, period. And it's based on some very sound principles in law of protecting privacy, and this is a good thing. But it's taken to such an extreme because of the way the law was created originally when the civil code was revised, that it is more rigid than in any other place, including other civil code jurisdictions like France. Okay, it's extremely difficult, and this is why we missed the boat. Partly, that was one of the reasons. The other thing to keep in mind is that despite that, there are places in the world that are doing it, not just in Israel. In the United States, for example, we have a big initiative at McGill in computational medicine, of which AI is one part, but there's the big data and so on. And we had a visit from somebody from the United States who was presenting a network of institutions looking at cancer databases. And what they were doing was, because nowadays cancers are treated by identifying specific molecules in the cancer that you can target very specifically, there are very few cases with just that mutation, right? So there may be thousands of cases of whatever cancer, colon cancer, or blood cancer, talk with my hands, gotta be careful, or blood cancer, but in any given hospital, even the very biggest hospitals, which the most cancer patients, the Princess Margaret's or the MD Andersons, they still only have one case or two cases. So what they've been doing is pooling their data across the United States to try and that way have access to 20 cases or 30 cases so that they can start to answer questions. And I think even in Quebec, it'll become obvious at some point that the government, in fairness, is working hard to try and change. It's not a trivial thing to fix. That being said, that I also think there's a generational aspect to your question, because people over a certain age have one concept of privacy, which my experience with people under whatever that age is, certainly under 30, have a completely different concept of privacy. I think we all know that. And things that I would never post on Facebook are posted on Facebook without any compunction whatsoever. And that for sure is going to change things, because people are going to see that balance that Kevin talked about shift a little bit, because people will be more tolerant of being a bit more public, at the same time understanding that there is a tremendous advantage to being able to anonymously see data in large numbers of people. You can answer questions that cannot be answered in any other way. There's no way, no one is going to pay for a clinical trial of 2 million people, which might be necessary to answer some questions. So great question.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? I see the 5-minute sign is coming up, but we don't have to stick to 5 minutes, because if there are no other questions, I'm going to, is that okay, Donna? Am I allowed to? Yes, okay. Donna gives me permission. I'm going to thank the panelists for showing up and for their excellent talks and presentations. I want to thank you all for your attention. Before we break, I'd like to ask Vincenza to come back up, please.
I'd like to thank the speakers this evening. It was very interesting to hear your thoughts and stories, and congratulations, Alexandra, on your Rhodes Scholarship. What a great achievement. It was interesting to learn about the world that awaits our future doctors, and I am supremely confident that McGill University, Faculty of Medicine at McGill University, can and will prepare our children for brilliant medical careers in a continuously evolving and increasingly challenging world. But I'm here to tell you that the Faculty of Medicine needs our support to continue to provide the quality education that it does to our children. Last fall, the McGill Medicine Parents Committee launched a Friends and Family campaign, and we challenged parents in each year to contribute and support our children by donating any amount that they're comfortable with. And I'm really delighted to tell you that many parents rose to the occasion. We're aiming for 100% participation, but unfortunately, we're not yet close to achieving full participation. So I'm here to ask you to please support our children and the Faculty of Medicine by donating any amount that you're comfortable with. And in making your donation, we encourage you to support the wellness program, which provides wellness resources for our children. Or you may choose to support Medicine's Greatest Needs, which provides funds to the Dean for various projects. There's a donation table at the reception area, I believe, which I invite you to visit. Members of the advancement team will be there to answer any questions that you may have. And thank you for joining us, and I really hope that we can count on you to help us make the Friends and Family campaign a success.
Thank you, Vincenza. Just a point, just to say that Vincenza is not a graduate of our medical school. She is a graduate of McGill and Université Sherbrooke, but we're really grateful for your work as a president of the Parents Committee and a member of the Faculty Advisory Board. So just to finish up, I'd like to offer a small gift to each of the panelists. How do you want to work this, Donna? Yes, Donna will hand them out. So just to say thank you very, very much. It's really appreciated. We really appreciate the fact that you took your time to be here and to show off a little bit why McGill is such a cool place. Thank you very much.